Hello and welcome. I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're making a 1872 polonaise gown, and we're talking about what was the silhouette that was fashionable at this time, what led up to that, and what actually is a polonaise. Let's start by looking at what was the fashion of 1872. This is the first bustle era, and the first bustle era is called that because, well, the silhouette was a bustle, so a lot of junk in the trunk. And this is the first one. There is the natural form era, where skirts got very narrow in between, and the silhouette is more natural, meaning there aren't big hoops and other skirt supports that would create a huge proportionate silhouette that has nothing to do with the actual female body. Natural form silhouette isn't natural either. There's definitely corsetry and even padding involved in that, but it's more natural than the huge bustle before it and the huge bustle that came after it. To figure out how we got to the bustle silhouette, we need to go all the way back to 1840s. 1840s is just after the huge 1830s. Gigot sleeves had gone away, and the sleeve had dropped to a natural silhouette, and the silhouette was much more severe than the whimsical silhouette before that, and skirts had gotten to full length, and they were very voluminous. And throughout the 1840s and 50s, skirts gained more and more volume. This was at first created by adding more and more petticoats. You'd have starched petticoats, you'd have corded petticoats, you'd have quilted petticoats, and also crinoline or horsehair petticoats. All the way up until 1856, when the first hoop skirt is developed. And now, even though we do actually call hoop skirts modernly a lot of times crinolines, that's actually incorrect because crinoline actually means horsehair petticoat, as in you can nowadays find crinoline tape or fabric. Usually nowadays it's made out of plastic, but you can still find horsehair ones too. So now when the hoop skirt was invented, it freed up women's legs from these cumbersome layers of petticoats because all you needed is that one hoop skirt with the metal wires or metal hoops and then a petticoat to smooth over those lines, but that was it. So it really allowed a lot freer air circulation, a lot easier movement, and it was a lot less heavy to carry, especially if it rained, because soggy hems are really heavy. So in the first few years, basically skirts, they just drastically grow in size because you can all of a sudden create a much wider silhouette with these hoop skirts. But very fast as we get into the 1860s, you start seeing the volume shifting towards the back. So that because you can create now with hoops different sorts of shapes. It doesn't have to be that round bell shape. So as the volume shifts towards the back, the front gets smoother and the line gets less wide in the front, and it kicks out really into the back. But these skirts are still huge. There's a lot of talk in that era and a lot of satire prints that are left over to our day of women taking up the entire sidewalk and men having to go around them and not having room to walk with these giant hoop skirts that women are wearing. But as the 60s progresses, the hoop skirts get smaller and the volume stays very much in the back. So as the silhouette narrows, and the volume stays in the back, eventually it reaches the point where it is very narrow at the top and all of the volume is in the back basically, and fairly low. So logically, the next step from that is that the volume starts rising. But this time, the volume doesn't rise in the front, it rises only in the back, and that creates eventually the bustle. So by the time we get to the late 1860s and early 1870s, the volume is very clearly in the back, and it is quite high again. This is created by either crinolets, so where there's a bustle and a crinoline kind of together, And then eventually it also starts morphing into a separate garment. These are often very short garments, and they're meant to be worn with heavily starched petticoats because the silhouette is still fairly wide at the legs. And this is one of the key features that separates the early bustle era or the first bustle era from the second bustle era, is that in the first bustle era, the skirt silhouette in the front is much wider. It flares out to the bottom of the legs. Whereas in the second bustle, another key feature of the silhouette of the 1870s that has been developing from the 1860s is that corsetry technology has advanced very fastly. Before that, corsetry tended to be fairly light and fairly lightly boned. You already could have the split bust as early as the late 1830s, but it really doesn't become the standard until the 1860s. As the split bust takes hold, also different types of patterns and techniques of creating a corset pretty much explode, and you start seeing several different ways. Before that, most of the corsetry you see tends to be a few pieces, usually front and back, and then gores added in there to create the proper shape. But at this point, you start seeing a lot more variation in the number of gores. You start seeing different shapes being made, and you also start seeing corset patterns that are made out of straight up and down pieces that have the curves built into them rather than having separate gores that are added into the corset to create the proper hourglass silhouette. But in this era still, the waist actually isn't that nipped in, because what would be the point of taking in the waist a lot with corsetry when you have these huge skirts that make, in proportions, your waist look tiny? There isn't really much need for that. So the thing that really changes in silhouette in corsetry is, and because of course you can't see your hips, so that isn't really important in corsetry yet. So the thing that really changes is your bust shape and where it is in proportion to your body. In the early 60s, but the bust is still fairly high, but it starts lowering and lowering during the 60s. And by the time we get to the early 70s, it is at its lowest. It's not like it's still a rounded bust. It's still definitely not a droopy bust, but it is a fairly low and very low rounded shape. So that makes also your waist seem very short, especially combined with the huge bustle that starts. Because in history, despite us thinking that the Victorian hourglass silhouette is for the male gaze, fashion actually was designed by women, and it was more about silhouette than actual body size or shape. So these silhouettes were very much. Another key feature of the early 1870s silhouette and gowns is a lot of trim. There are still some fairly simple gowns with less trimming, but the abundance of ruffles and lace and different sorts of fancy trimmings is really a feature of the 70s. And this is also kind of carried on from the 1860s. In the beginning of the 60s, your skirts are still, even though they're huge, they're at their biggest, and oftentimes they just show off the fabric rather than having a whole bunch of trim on them. But as the 60s progresses, gowns start to have more and more details and trim on them, because this is also the time when the sewing machine really explodes in popularity. So more and more people have access to the sewing machine, making the actual sewing the seams of a garment much faster, so that the way to show wealth wasn't anymore so much of, oh, I have this huge gown, because that was fairly fast to sew. But it became of, I have this and this trim, I have this and this much things that need to be done by hand. These details, these embroideries, these appliques, whatever things that can't be done solely by machine, or that are expensive on their own even if they are applied by machine. so that that's the way of showing wealth. And this continues in the 70s, and that's why 70s gowns often are an explosion of trim. Though there are simpler gowns, but these tend to have then appliques or embroidery or something else to really elevate them. And that's one of the things that you can tell when a gown is maybe more middle class than upper class is if it doesn't have. And because fashion is cyclic, with the explosion of different kinds of trims, basically the 18th century comes into fashion, because the 18th century, especially the later Rococo period, is an explosion of trims. That, of course, was completely done by hand, and then the gowns were done by hand. So it's taking from that idea of how much that work that trimming takes and now applying it with a sewing machine. And a lot of the same elements that were fashionable in the 18th century become fashionable. Not only just the trimming, but also the shapes of the dresses. There's a lot of crossover you can see, and especially the biggest crossover is the polonaise gown. The polonaise gown became first fashionable in the 1770s and 80s, and it is basically a gown that is built in one piece, the bodice and the skirt portion, whereas most gowns of the 18th century at this point have a separate bodice and separate skirts that are attached to that. Though sometimes the back pieces, like in the English gown or the robe à la Francais, have definitely the back and the skirt are. Another very common feature of the polonaise is that the skirts tend to be lifted up or bustled up so that they create 3 loops. And that is often why in modern times you can see the polonaise confused with other styles, especially in museum catalogs, because for a long time they actually thought that the defining feature of a polonaise gown was that bustling up of the skirts, when in fact it's the lack of waist seam. And like the polonaise was very different from most fashionable gowns in the 18th century by not having that waist seam at all, whereas most had, the defining feature and the thing that separates the polonaise from most other dresses or gowns of the 1870s is the fact that most of them had a separate bodice, then they had a separate overskirt on top of the actual skirt. Whereas the polonaise has the overskirt and the bodice in one. And keeping in line with the Rococo fashion, most polonaises of the 1870s were usually striped fabrics like silk, or then they were floral fabrics, very much reminiscent of the fabrics that were used in the 1770s and 1780s. And this style was called the Dolly Varden style. The name Dolly Varden comes from a Charles Dickens novel that was published in 1841 called Barnaby Rudge, and the character is described as a coquette, or similar to what we would call a dandy, or a flamboyant dresser, or I don't know, whatever more modern term you could come up with, but basically it's somebody who's very fashionable and kind of outrageous with their fashions. These Dolly Varden prints could be made either as regular cotton prints, or they could be cotton chintzes like they were very commonly in the 18th century, or they could be silk. They could be printed silk, painted silk, or even more commonly woven silk brocades or ikat fabric. Ikat is different than brocade because ikat is painted before it is woven, and then as you weave it in, the pattern kind of morphs into there, but it's not very, it doesn't have strict borders. Whereas a brocade is where you use different sorts of threads as you weave to weave in the pattern. Now these Dolly Varden polonaises could be either day gowns or even evening gowns. Not really ball gowns, those are the evening gowns that don't have sleeves, but different sorts of dinner and other evening function gowns that would have sleeves. These polonaises could also have that low neck that was very typical of 18th century gowns. But because those low necks weren't really a thing in the Victorian era for daytime, in the daytime, if you wore this sort of gown, it was very common to see also a kerchief, another 18th century feature, draped over the neck area to kind of fill it out, the neckline, and make it more daytime appropriate for the Victorian era. Other options were that you would have a false waistcoat or actual waistcoat underneath, or knitted jerseys advertised as being worn underneath this type of lower necklines for daytime. These jerseys could be home knitted, or you could also buy them from a store. Another variation on this gown is simply having a higher neckline that is more typical of the Victorian era for daytime. For evening time, of course, the low neckline was typical, and that was usually left bare the same way as in any other fashionable garment of the Victorian era. Another key feature of the 1780s fashion that is also brought into the 1870s is having a different pattern or fabric for the skirt portion as you do for the bodice portion. You see this a lot in the 1780s as the gown being a different fabric from the skirt worn underneath or petticoat worn underneath. And the same thing happens also with 1870s fashion. And this is really the era where they start the combination of different fabrics in different ways that you see for the rest of the Victorian era, where even in one bodice you can have two different fabrics. And especially with the striped, and even more with the floral Dolly Varden style polonaises, you usually see a solid color skirt with them. Or you can see a striped skirt also. I decided to go with a ribbed silk taffeta, and it would have been one of the most fashionable silks of that era. And because of the war that was going on in France, these kind of silks were extremely hard to get and extremely expensive, also in the US and everywhere else in Europe, because the war drove up prices. So in the magazines of the era, they often recommend that if you can't find this sort of striped taffeta, for evening wear especially, because that is not under a lot of wear and tear, it is more delicate, you can get away with basically a dupioni, something really slubbed that when you hold it up against the light, you can see that it is very see-through, even though it looks fairly thick when you look at it. So in my opinion, that sounds very much like a modern slub dupioni. So keep that in mind, that if you are doing especially an evening gown from 1870s, dupioni might actually be an accurate option. And like I mentioned before, usually polonaises were bustled up, meaning that they were lifted up with something or draped up. A lot of times these were tacked, or there was some sort of button system on the inside, both in the 18th century and in the Victorian era. But one option also that I found in fashion magazines from this era was having a belt that has loops that bustle up your polonaise. And I thought that this was really cool, because this way I could also wear it other ways if I decided not to wear it with a belt. And I actually had an antique belt buckle that would go perfectly with this. And one of the very common materials for belts in this period, and for also all kinds of drapery loops and different like little bits of and bobs and bows that you would attach to the polonaises, was different sorts of ribbons, and especially velvet ribbon. So that's what I decided to use for mine. And I also made a little velvet bag that would go, called a chatelaine bag, that would attach to this belt. And I made it so that the loops are separate, so that I can also take the loops off and wear it with other Victorian styles that wouldn't need the bustling up in the back and wouldn't need that bit, but they can still use the same belt and the chatelaine bag. And even though the skirt has it has the separate chatelaine bag, the skirt still usually had pockets or pocket holes, depending on the style. But because of the way this skirt is built, it is built only with a few gores and there isn't one directly at your side. So I decided to make the skirt with pockets rather than having the separate pocket that I usually wear, because it was more convenient with the way the seams were. So the idea of the chatelaine purse is basically that there you would have the bits and bobs that you would need the most. So for instance, if you were going out, you might have a few coins in them, and then most of your stuff you would have in your pockets. Or like me in the modern era, I will have my phone most likely and most often in the chatelaine bag, because that's where it's most convenient and easiest to get out of, and it won't be pulling on my pockets, because a phone can be rather heavy and bulky, and when you have pockets that are attached to the skirt, it can sometimes show that it is kind of pulling on that seam where the pocket is attached to.
For my skirt, I used my self-drafted petticoat pattern as my guide and just changed it a bit. I start by cutting out my skirt fabric, and my pocket may get out a cotton sateen, and add a silk facing to the visible edge. Then the pockets are French seamed. I serged my silk edges to keep them from fraying, but in the period they would have either been overlocked by hand or bound with tape. The seam that the pockets go into is partly sewn to the bit where the pocket goes in, and then the pocket is inserted into the seam. And then rest of the seam is sewn normally. I hand sew a bar tack to keep the edge of the pocket from fraying. And the other edge of the pocket is hand sewn onto the skirt, while the top edge of the pocket is just whipped shut, since there's no real wear to this area. The rest of the skirt seams are sewn together, and the top of the back skirt panel is gathered. And the skirt is attached to a polished cotton waistband. And the skirt hem is faced with a lightweight linen. For the hem flounce, I roll hem the bottom edge and gather the top with my ruffler foot, and machine sew it and a box pleated ruffle on top of it. For the polonaise, I couldn't find a pattern I liked, so I just drafted my own based on the fashion plates. And as you can see from my mock-up, my drafting was correct, so I don't need to change anything. The bodice portion of my polonaise is lined with cotton, and I sew the cotton lining and the silk fashion fabric in one. And press the seams flat. And remember to clip your seams so that your seams can lay flat. The front edges of the gown are machine sewn together because it will be covered in trim anyways. And after the lining ends, they are roll hemmed. I baste the sleeves onto the gown before I machine sew them on, just to make sure that they fit properly. For my trim, I cut 4-inch strips of silk and a 2-inch strip for the neckline, that I then connect into one continuous strip and then roll hem them, and then pleat onto the dress. And then I machine stitch all the trim on. The polonaise closes with hooks and eyes that I sew on my body because I find that easiest to fit them correctly. And lastly, I make sleeve flounces out of the silk and a cotton lawn using my 18th century sleeve flounce pattern. The sleeve edge is turned and the flounce is pleated on top, and then hand sewn on with a running back stitch. And trim is added to the edge. And here it is, the finished polonaise gown worn with a linen kerchief and a silk bonnet. The skirts are bustled up into the belt loop. I'm really quite happy with how this turned out, though I do need to actually oil the hinges on the belt buckle because that makes it very hard to properly tighten it. Like you can see, it's a little drooping here on the side. I'll leave you guys with some more detail footage of the gown, but I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button because it really does help out in this world. And subscribe if you haven't done that already and you'd like to, because I would love to see you again next time. Bye!